now that the war in Afghanistan has ended, does that change the way we judge how it began? So all these questions that you just brought up about just cause and right intention and so on, and a 20-year war, like a lot of that stuff is going to shift as it goes. Does something happen when a war ends that now we can judge better, or what? What's the view at the end of the war? What do you think?
Just off the cuff, in some ways, I want to say that we judge the war worse, and I only say that because, as we see right now, there's just so much turmoil over where do things stand compared to what the goals were. How do we reconcile, the lives lost there, whether they be, American soldiers, American civilians, or non-Americans. I get tired of the loss of life being restricted only to, Americans. But all that loss of life and how to reconcile that with the war being ended in a manner that's maybe not the achievement of so many of the objectives that were both respectable and, being invested in, that can make us a worse judge, I think, in terms of struggling with the fact that those losses occurred and families right now are suffering. And yet, we still seem to have an Afghanistan that's in a lot of turmoil and perhaps quite possibly being, a place where terrorist training activities can occur again, or terrorist groups can receive some sympathy.
Who gets to decide, right? That's one question about whether that war was successful or not.
Right. In terms of who gets to decide, I think it needs to be something that we all wrestle with. Part of that, though, means caring enough to wrestle and come to grips with the reality of how things are and the history of how things have come to be. Having been actually a military planner in several of my other non-teaching jobs, I've spent maybe more time thinking about objectives and how achievable are some objectives versus others. And part of that being, how well can military units contribute to the achievement of those objectives? How much do we need to change our training so we're more ready for certain kinds of objectives versus others? At what point are we asking the military maybe to be good at too many different things? Here too, having lived versions of this in Iraq, it is easy and so tempting to want to report success because you don't want maybe your own year out there, to have been a waste of time. It also becomes obviously really, really important to be honest about things so that some objectives anyway can be identified as just being not realistic, right? In my own wrestling with Afghanistan, I feel like I'm just going to be reflecting maybe what you see, the ideas you see in several op-eds, pro and con Afghanistan. But I'll simply share that, I think some kind of reaction after 9/11 was warranted to precisely interrupt the terrorist training camps that are going on and that kind of activity. I do wonder if how realistic the rest of the goals are, right, to do the regime change that was being attempted in Afghanistan. And part of it for me would be looking at, well, how many assumptions did we have that were bad assumptions maybe to plan off of? The idea of Afghanistan being a singular nation that simply you could replace the regime with something new and you've got, a unified country that's now on a new track. When, of course, the painful reality learned over the last 20 years is that it should not be looked at as so unitary, right? That in fact, it's got all sorts of competing areas, competing groups, competing ideologies, competing priorities. And so there's all sorts of ways that I wish that would have fed more into the decision on what objectives to pursue.
Yeah, I've been reading these same op-eds and it's, we just don't know, right? Still a lot to be figured out. This may sound like a dumb question, but if a war is not successful, and I'm not sure that Afghanistan was not successful. We still need to have that question. But if a war is not successful, that doesn't mean it's not a just war, right? There could be just wars and just soldiers who fight wars for the right intention and so on, but it fails. And that's not
But it
the
fails.
soldier's fault, right? That's just the way the world works. Or what do you think about that?
Yeah. No, I think that's an important point to recognize. I don't know, military culture, American military culture is such that it could be a very hard point to recognize because, we, in our training and our education and kind of the mindset is, you get the job done no matter what. And I think it really has led to certainly some of the struggle that soldiers and veterans have, in that it seems like maybe we did not achieve all the objectives desired. How much is that on us would be very much the kind of ownership, right, that military culture tends to promote. It might promote it to too much of an extreme. And we need to recognize maybe that ability that some objectives or some justifications could very well be there. And like you say, you're just not successful in the justified war that you take on. That right there might be the motivation some have for saying we need to stay there. And in that it's a not yet, it's not a not ever. But yeah, it could very well be that we just need to recognize that justified wars are not guaranteed wins. And it's sure not for lack of people and resources put into the effort over the last 20 years. My goodness.
So here's another question about that. I've just been really thinking about this Afghanistan. We still need to talk about empathy. So let's switch gears.
Oh, right. Yeah.
But maybe this is related to empathy, which is some people will claim that the way to win a war is just bomb them into submission, right? So, I mean, one argument that someone could make, I wouldn't make it, but someone could make about Afghanistan is that we would have won the war a long time ago if we'd have taken off the gloves and just, bombed them to smithereens and completely destroyed their society and then rebuilt it from the ground up, sort of like what happened in Western Europe, the Second World War.
Right.
What do you think about that? It's a realist kind of argument. The war would have ended sooner. We'd have been out of there. We'd have been done with it.
Yeah.
We'd have killed millions of people.
I think the negative piece answer, that's a term I've picked up from some of the research I do, right? Of, hey, one way to achieve peace is just to eliminate all, right? Of the adversaries who are doing these things. And this would be that. So negative peace would be maybe the term I'd want to give the proposition just offered by Andy, right? That we could just eliminate them all, somehow start over. I don't know if we're really going to treat that realistically for 1 minute. That wasn't meant to be a pun right off the ism that we call realism, but if we want to treat it honestly, right? Not convinced it'll do what it's meant to do, because that's got all sorts of ways of inventing new enemies and all sorts of ways of galvanizing the rest of the world against the one country that might be doing that. And so there's that maybe kind of, if nothing else, kind of pragmatic reason to avoid that. And let alone, the much more maybe principled reason of it, hey, it's just wrong to commit mass murder. There's also, there's also a bad assumption built into that, right? The assumption that all Afghans are terrorists, or all the people of either Iraq or Afghanistan are all on board with 9/11 and with what happened. This is where soldiers and veterans have much greater insight than maybe their average civilian citizens, because they've been, face to face in both of these places and seen just how many Iraqis, just how many Afghans are wanting to do precisely what you and I want to do, which is to enjoy their families, to have a livelihood, to live life in a peaceable manner, in a way that they find honorable and respectable, to their culture or their ultimate commitments. Yeah, so I guess the place to start is this term empathy. It might surprise many of you to know that it is in Army doctrine. And in fact, in our leadership manual, we have one where, hey, these are what makes for a good leader. In the leadership manual, when it defines empathy, it talks about the understanding or coming to grasp the experience of another. And it points out that by the other, we mean fellow soldiers. So for a leader, maybe to empathize with their subordinates, that can be important. But then it goes on to list not only fellow soldiers, maybe civilians, non-combatants, and it explicitly mentions enemies as well. So here I have a moment of Army doctrine saying we should empathize with our enemies. And I'm convinced, half my teammates in uniform maybe just don't get what that means. I mean, that sounds odd. And I assume for many of you, right, this also is a controversial claim, right? So that was the impetus for me jumping into this research, right? Of like, what sense could that make? And does something like empathy really deserve to be in our doctrine? The short of it, right? So fast forwarding through all the research, I'll try not to drag you through all the ins and outs, except for the ones that you want to ask about, right? But would be, I'm convinced empathy is vital, both for war to be conducted well and for a soldier to live with themselves well. I think empathy improves both the competence and the character of a soldier in the conduct of war. Here too, there's a real pragmatic moment of, to the extent that you understand another and their experience, that would include their priorities, what motivates them, even how they're likely to make decisions. Notice how this can be a pragmatic benefit when you're trying to anticipate what an enemy is going to do. So there's even this way where empathizing with an enemy, I think, can help you better understand what they might do. That right there becomes really relevant too when it comes to the individuals who are figuring out what could end the war well, if there's negotiations going on or something like that. Empathy clearly has a role to play there. But even for your lowest foot soldier, so not the soldier maybe involved in some kind of communication with the enemy leaders, but foot soldier to foot soldier, empathy becomes important because of this anticipation of what they might do just on the tactical level, but then also becomes important because empathy can help you discriminate better on when it might be justified to pull the trigger and when it's not. Empathy is a helpful antidote for dehumanization. And that is its whole important conversation that I have with cadets even, right? Is, do you have to dehumanize others in order to kill them? Which is one important duty that soldiers have to be ready to do. I argue it's not our reason for existence, or it's not the only thing we do. We have to be ready to employ force, but we shouldn't be ready to maximize force all the time, or our success should not be measured by just how many we kill. That's downright dangerous. And I mean, you can just go to the Vietnam War maybe, and the metric of body count for an example of just how that can make things go haywire. So empathy is a way of staving off maybe those poorer kinds of metrics, and a way of retaining maybe a professional judgment on the part of a soldier on when killing has to be employed. Notice that by keeping dehumanization away, you're also better able to avoid war crimes and the things that sometimes people will do when they've stopped thinking of others as humans and started thinking of them as something less, whether it be insects or all the terms and labels that can get put on other people. So yeah, empathy, I'm convinced, becomes really vital to avoid these things.
This you anticipated my question, my worry. It seems like it would be easier to kill people if you didn't have empathy with them.
Yeah.
But I think you're suggesting it's about killing the right people in morally limited, appropriate ways. Like that's the thing that matters.
Yeah, I lean a lot on a metaphor that maybe many of this audience will find helpful if you're not convinced just by my theoretical talk, right? But take a surgeon, for example. If I'm the patient of a surgeon, I very much want the surgeon to be empathetic in all our pre-operational conversations and all our post-operational conversations, even if I'm willing to admit in the middle of surgery, sure, I don't want the surgeon being empathetic with the pain he or she might be causing me, in the midst of doing the surgery. There's a moment there where certainly empathy maybe needs to be the thing that's toned down, but it very much is important before and after. And I think it's really similar with soldiers, that in the act of killing, in the pulling of the trigger, I don't argue in my own work that empathy ought to be prominent, but I also think it's going way too far to make that killing easier with moments of dehumanization or becoming callous to the fellow humans that they very much are. And then when you really start thinking through the rest of the decisions that soldiers make before and after, say, the killing moment, empathy becomes vital to all that activity. Yeah.
Kevin, I don't want to keep you forever on. I mean, thank you for sharing. I just have to ask one more question about this empathy thing, because you just made me think. Wouldn't it be worse for someone who does kill to have a lot of empathy? Because then guilt, regret, PTSD, moral injury, all that. I mean, there's a sense, and I'm not in the world that you're in, so it's just outsider.
Yeah.
Wouldn't it be better to be
I
like a robot and to kind of tamp down all those human feelings so that I don't feel guilty and I don't live with.
This is the single biggest kind of counterpoint that I try to wrestle with, in my own advocacy for empathy, is this exact idea, right? That does it invite moral injury, or does it invite all the struggles that you talked about? It can, in the way that I think empathy can be the conduit for those things to come in. But I compare empathy to, say, my eyesight. I might get blinded by the sun's glare, but notice that we don't blame our eyes for that glare and that pain that comes with it. I think empathy is the same thing. Empathy, too, is the conduit maybe for those struggles to be introduced. But what we ought to be blaming would be the dehumanization attitudes or the militaristic attitudes that maybe we had going into war, and then only coming up face to face with enemies do we realize that those attitudes were so poor and inaccurate, right? That then in a kind of unavoidable empathetic moment we catch on like, oh, they're humans on the other side of the battlefield. And notice that there's two ways of coping with that. One way, we see this portrayed in a lot of movies, right, is going callous and being indifferent and becoming precisely the robot that I mentioned before. But that's got all sorts of problems in its own way. And, in terms of war crimes or other things that it invites, and human that soldier remains, it's also probably a coping mechanism that can never last. At some point, most people who serve in war are going to be doing some reflection on what happened. So the callous turn becomes an unhealthy reaction, even if empathy, maybe unfettered, can also lead to an unhealthy reaction of moral injury, right? This moment of feeling extreme guilt, even when maybe no one can seem to point to a war crime that you did commit, right? I think it's precisely because of a lack of understanding of war and its moral aspect that's to be more to blame, because then you have no way of processing your empathy. If you get into empathy research, now I'm talking like neuroscientists and psychologists and this kind of thing, there's an aspect of empathy that's unavoidable, by the way. There's a kind of subconscious form of empathy that just occurs, at least in healthy humans. If it's not occurring, right, you may very well be dealing with a sociopath or something like that. So, and so this is the other reason maybe that coping in some other way might be temporary only, in that we need to be equipping soldiers to properly process empathetic turns. Do you have time for a war story? I don't want to.
No, I have time. I'm worried about your time, so feel free. Yeah.
Yeah. No, so my first deployment to Iraq, so not Afghanistan, but a similar counterinsurgency effort. There was strong intelligence that in our area of operations, there was an individual living at this one house who was responsible for coordinating and funding a number of insurgent attacks that were going on in the area. And so it fell on my unit to conduct a raid in the middle of the night to detain the individual, and if there was sufficient threat and resistance, maybe kill the individual. So I had a few soldiers who were part of the operation, and in fact were the ones kicking the door in and entering this house. Immediately there was a shadowy figure that was kind of bent over and lunging at them. And in the split-second decision, there's a concern that what might he be holding, because he was apparently hunched over like this. And so two of the individual soldiers shot the figure that was coming at them, who fell over. The soldiers inspected the rest of the house and secured it, within a few seconds or a minute. And they returned to that individual, and they started rendering first aid to this individual that they had just shot. He passed away. And in the securing of the house, they ran across what was clearly a mother and daughter. We all identified this individual as, in fact, the individual that we're hoping to detain. And we figured out that this was his family, that we now had an Iraqi woman who's a widow and a daughter who is no longer going to grow up with the father. And those impacts really stuck with one of the soldiers who had been part of that formation that went into the door. And it was a couple weeks after that I had his squad leader and chain of command approach me. I was the commander of this element of about 100 soldiers, and say, hey, Sergeant so-and-so is really struggling with all that. I was able to have some conversations with him, and one reaction by leaders in the Army can be just to shut down those emotional concerns, right? But I didn't want to do that, because even then I had this kind of intuitive concern that I didn't want him to be callous, even if I didn't want him to go the other extreme and be so wrapped up in it that maybe he could no longer function as a soldier, right? But he just had a hard time realizing or perceiving this individual no longer as just an enemy that in some vague way was almost responsible for the war or something. But now, in fact, my soldier shared this identity with him, because my soldier had at that time and still does have a daughter and a wife, who is back home in the United States. And that all that kind of shared parallel concern really, really hit him hard. So I have thought back on that experience and realized that if there's a way for a soldier to reconcile the empathetic understanding of that enemy with a proper understanding of what we're doing, that makes for a soldier notice that I can trust more than if the soldier were just to go all callous and sure, continues maybe to be ready and willing to go on patrols and all this stuff, but that soldier's judgment might be something that I would trust less. So yeah, maybe that just helps as an illustration of the kind of balance I think there needs to be with empathy.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's sort of like the performance criteria, right? So how well will someone perform those psychological, intellectual, emotional capacities? Like, we need that in the world, Probably police need that, and doctors need that, and teachers need that.
Right. This notion of moral injury, so much of the research on it has been motivated by folks who work with veterans. But there's absolutely, you can see parallel terms in some of these other professions. The nursing profession in their literature talks about moral distress, and it's an identical issue. And in fact, in some of the more recent literature, right, everyone's kind of taking on that term of moral injury. One last comment on this relation of empathy with moral injury. Not only can a proper understanding of things on the front end, I think empathy can help prevent moral injury, because it ensures that your judgment maybe is appropriate in the midst of conducting the war. I also think empathy can contribute a lot in the recovery from moral injury. One aggravating factor to moral injury can be a soldier being very, very isolated and therefore just free to pile on the guilt on themselves. But if they can exercise a kind of empathy with a circle of peers or caregivers, this can help bring them out of that and help them see themselves the way that they, or those caregivers, see the soldier. And that right there requires some empathy, right? Like I love one moment of empathy research I ran across where Edith Stein writes about how empathy can contribute to your self-knowledge, because in empathizing with others, you come to grasp how they experience you. And that right there maybe becomes vital for a soldier struggling with something like moral injury. It's a way to overcome the isolation, because you can see yourself the way that they see, which maybe is not the moral monster that you've come to see yourself as. So yeah, not only is empathy compatible with soldiering, I think there's all sorts of ways it becomes really important to help the soldier grapple with all the complexities of service.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It sounds reasonable to me. This is important, I think.
Good.
I don't want to keep you much longer, so maybe can I just invite you for the final couple of minutes? Are you hopeful? I always like to ask the people I'm talking, how's the world stacking up from your perspective? And I'm thinking again back to Afghanistan and this 20-year war that's ended, and we're not sure if we won or we're not sure what happened. How is your thinking about all of this stuff? Where are you in terms of thinking about what's going on in the world and at West Point in terms of the evolution of the military? Because I think the stuff that you're talking about, it's not what we're seeing in the movies with General Patton. This seems to be a different approach. We just invite you a couple minutes to reflect on hope and where we are and where we need to be going.
Yeah, no, thanks. It might be the hardest question in many ways, right? One thing I haven't done much of in my research, and to me it's an agenda item that could be worth pursuing, is the role of empathy in the use ad bellum stuff. So much of what we've been talking about with empathy is empathy in the conduct of war. But one place for hope for me would be an empathetic understanding of others in those decisions about war overall, or in the international politics level. Empathy's got a vital role to play there. I've even run across terms of something like strategic empathy, and it's precisely this argument that empathy has an appropriate role to play in the interaction of states. So, I don't know, to the extent that empathy continues to get more and more attention that it's gotten over it actually has gotten increased attention over the last couple of decades. I think that's a source of hope. There are plenty of countervailing forces as people take solace in their little subgroup. And I mean that either in their specific nation state, contrary to other nation states, or in our own country, right? I mean, the political groups that are contrary to these other political groups, that will be the end of us. And that will be the end of a just and lasting peace, will be the closed-minded insistence on of a zero-sum game that someone else's gain is automatically our loss. If that is all that's in the imagination of us as citizens, or in the minds of our political leaders, we're in for a lot of trouble. So I really hope that the zero-sum game can be kept in its place. Philosopher that I am, I guess, I want to be thorough. I think there are circumstances that qualify as a true zero-sum game where maybe it is us or them, but darn it, that moment is not the norm, and we need to fight it off in every responsible way that we can, and be looking for the common ground that there very much is. One last comment on this is that I don't think any resistance to terrorism or terroristic activity can lean on merely us in the military doing. The best the military can be is a stopgap. And then there's got to be a bunch of other things going on by a bunch of other federal agencies and non-government, folks, right? Whether it be faith-based organizations or nonprofits, but us in the military, we ourselves need to understand this. And then I do think, our political leaders and civilian citizens need to understand that the military can only be asked to do certain things that are at a certain extreme. And then there's a lot of other work, diplomatic work, and other investment and stuff that is going to address those root causes of terrorism. And that's the only way to maybe really make genuine progress again in that effort.